And welcome back to the 6Ps podcast, where today we're going to be channeling some Richie Benno and looking at chapter 22 from the Dressmaker. So when looking at our areas of comparison for these texts, when it comes to chapter 22, we're going to be focusing on these three particularly. So the idea of conflict and disunity, especially conflict within relationships, and also disunity within the town. We start to see it bubble to the surface here. The theme of love and trust comes up too, particularly through Trudy and William's relationship, as well as Marigold and Evan. And this last one about truth, appearance, and deception is prevalent here too, particularly the idea of appearance and the link here to fashion. One thing that's not mentioned, and one of probably the major reasons why I selected chapter 22 for analysis, is the fact that there's a lot of humour in this one, and I think, and we'll discuss it a little bit later on, but this is definitely something you can channel in your essays when it comes to the stylistic features of the texts and how this differs from, say, the Crucible, I should say. So, the chapter summary, it begins with William unhappily pondering his life and particularly his marriage. Marigold hosts the women of the town as Elspeth formally introduces Una Pleasance and Le Salon. And it doesn't quite go to script, and a farce ensues. We have Marigold knocked out, Trudy giving birth, and a real rise in hysteria, which again we can link really closely to the Crucible in certain aspects. But let's start with our reading. William was slumped in a battered deck chair on what was now called the back patio, formerly the porch. Little things here, the fact that he was slumped, you've got negative connotations here, and the fact he's sitting on a battered deck chair, not, I would think, something that I would attribute to the very wealthy Beaumont family. And again, that hint that things aren't all financially right with the Beaumonts. You could also make reference to the word patio, which is definitely an American term. Formerly the porch, again a bit of an American term. We know that in Australia it would definitely be known as the veranda. Now his heavily pregnant wife sat inside, filing her nails, the telephone caught in the fatty folds of her chins and shoulder. Well, I said to Elspeth today that there's no hope of all of getting any of our mending back. Lunacy is hereditary, you know. Molly most likely murdered someone before she came here, so Lord knows what they get up to in that slum on that hill. Beulah's seen her milking the cow, and she sneaks along the creek to steal dead wood like a peasant in broad daylight. Doesn't look the least bit guilty. Elspeth and I were just saying the other day, thank heavens we've got Una. There's a lot that you could take out of that quotation of what Trudy says. The fact that lunacy is hereditary, there's a bit of foreshadowing here. We know, of course, that Trudy herself will get sent to a mental asylum. The fact that Beulah's seen her milking the cow, again, Beulah sees everything, and again, she goes blind. But not only do they attribute that to her being mad, that's what she has to do in order to survive the town's vitriol. Same deal as sneaking on the creek to steal dead wood. This is how she has to live in order to survive. And this is because of the town. She also said she doesn't look the least bit guilty, but she does feel that guilt, and that's expressed through that third-person omniscient narration that we see in the previous chapters. So look at how the women and Trudy and Elspeth view her behaviour. And again, this is a really interesting chapter because Tilly isn't involved at all. So we get that different perspective, how the town views Tilly as opposed to what we know about Tilly through that narration. Yes, muttered William, most important. He reached under his chair for the whiskey bottle, slopped a generous amount into the thick glass, held it up to his eye, and viewed the horse jumps into the front paddock through the amber liquid. Inside, his wife talked on. I'll get William's checkbook, but I really shouldn't have a new wardrobe until after the baby. Mustache. Here's Leslie with the car. See you there. William waited until the scurrying heels had ceased and the front door slammed. He sighed, drained his whiskey, refilled the glass, banged his pipe against the wooden armrest, and reached for his tobacco. So William uses alcohol and smoking, vices, in order to, maintain his sanity. And we see other characters, obviously, throughout the text who turn to things like alcohol, tobacco, drugs, in order to maintain their sanity. The other interesting thing about it is obviously their relationship continues to deteriorate. We know already that it wasn't based on much. In fact, it was based on their first meeting, which turned into quite a physical, intimate meeting. But we know there's no real love there. Similar, I guess, in different aspects, though, to Mona and Leslie. But we can compare that, obviously, to the more loving relationship that Tilly and Teddy had, and obviously that of Elizabeth Proctor and John Proctor in The Crucible. There's a bit of a page break, and then it says that Una Pleasant stood at Marigold's front door wearing a navy A-line with matching pumps, featuring a striped bow at the toes. "Please remove your shoes," she said to the arriving guests before they walked on Marigold's bright white floor. Beulah cruised the parlour, peering at photos and searching for dust on the skirting boards and picture rails. "What an unusual sideboard," she said, opening the top drawer. "It's antique, my grandmother's," said Marigold, worrying Beulah would leave fingerprints on her polish. "I chucked all my grandmother's old junk out," said Beulah. So I guess Beulah here again is being quite snoopy. That's that trait that tracks throughout the text. So too does Marigold and her incessant cleaning. That also tracks throughout the text. Just then Lois lumbered, and again, the verb here is very specific. Lois lumbered, not very graceful at all, past pushing Mrs. Almanac in her wheelchair. There were blinds in the tyres and oil traces on the axle. Marigold shuddered and ran to her room, grabbed a Beck's powder sachet, flung back her head and opened her mouth. She winced as the powder slid from its paper cradle onto her tongue, then reached for the tonic bottle on the bedside table, unscrewed the cap and sucked. Just then Beulah barged in. "Oh," she said, "your nerves again, is it?" She smiled and backed out. Marigold put her hand to her neck rash and took another long swig, then popped 2 tin oxide tablets onto her tongue for good measure. In the parlour, Beulah selected the chair in the corner for a prime view and sat with her chin tucked down, her arms folded over her white blouse and her skinny legs under her kilt. Obviously, I forgot to mention before, but again, the measures that Marigold goes to maintain her sanity, she too is drugged. And this is partly because of her husband as well, of course. Evan. We've seen Evan forcibly drug her previously and then obviously take advantage of her. Now the rest of the ladies sat on plastic-covered sitting room chairs, sipping tea from cups that tasted faintly of ammonia, tisk-tisking at the offered cream cake. So Marigold's stuff is very, very clean. I also like the fact that she's got plastic covering on the sitting room chairs. I am definitely having flashbacks to my grandmother's lounge suites at home that were definitely covered in plastic. When Lois landed on the couch next to Ruth Dim, stale air billowed. Again, a bit of humour. And Ruth pressed a hanky to her nose and moved to stand by the door. Then Muriel Pratt caused a stir when she arrived wearing a frock made by, quote, "that witch, just to show you what we're used to," she said to Una, who looked closely at it, then went to stand next to her display. Again, this idea of this is what they're used to. They've grown heirs, of course, but also the idea that they call Tilly a witch, even though to an extent she has transformed them. They still condemn her for that. For the opening of Le Salon, Una had provided a sample of her work. A mannequin stood in the corner wearing a button-through seersucker peasant floral frock with a flounce-collared neckline and small puffed sleeves. The mannequin wore vinyl Mexican moccasins to match and a small straw bonnet. Trying to be too French there. It was an outfit straight from Rockman's of Burke Street, catering for the not-so-slim figure. So there's a bit in this as well. It's a peasant frock, obviously that's the first one, that's pretty obvious. The fact that it's come straight from Rockman's of Burke Street, so it's come from Melbourne, not from Europe. And also we know that Rockman's, which is still around today, Rockman's isn't an upper class sort of women's fashion store. It's definitely for the working class more so. And the fact that it caters for the not so slim figure, we know that it's through fashion that Tilly is able to hide the women's physical flaws through the clothing, and obviously Una's not able to do that. And when Pearl arrived, she dumped a concave sponge on the table and said, "Lovely day," then turned to Una and looked her up and down. "Get sick of Evan or Marigold? You just come and camp at the pub. She lit a turf filter tip and, looking about her for an ashtray, spotted the mannequin in the corner. That one of the first things you made back at sewing school, is it? She asked with interest. So the dress that Una has shown the women doesn't really impress them. They think this is something that she did at school many, many years ago. Beulah turned to the Beaumonts standing together by the window like a grim wedding photograph from 1893. So that's really interesting there. That's a nice little simile. And said loudly, "My, you're big, Gert. I mean, Trudy. When exactly are you due?" There's a hint here that she's too big compared to the length of time she's been pregnant for. Mona offered the cake plate around again, and soon everyone's saucer was crammed with thick bricks of lemon slice, hedgehog, cinnamon tea cake, and pink cream lamingtons, and they were picking the crumbs and coconut flakes from their bosoms, so they're eating quite plentifully here. Quite greedy. When Marigold stepped red-faced and shaking into the crowded room, Mona handed her a cup of tea with a cream scone on the saucer. Nancy marched through the door behind her, bumping Marigold and sending her cup and saucer splashing onto the carpet. Marigold collapsed, her face resting in the tea and cream puddle, the two fluffy pods of scone dough resting at her ears. Again, it's quite comical, this scene. The clucking floral women assisted her to bed, and when finally they returned, Elspeth stepped to the table, clapping loudly, and began the formal proceedings. "We welcome Una to Dungata and wish to say..." Something as well, before I forget, is the idea that clucking floral women, again, they're referred to as like being chickens or hens. So as she's saying, "We welcome Una to Dungata and wish to say," it's at that moment that Trudy bellowed like a distressed cow and doubled over. Again, that simile that refers to an animal, a distressed cow, is how Trudy is described. There was a noise like a water bag bursting, and pink, steamy fluid flowed from her skirts, and a circle of carpet around her feet darkened. Her belly was lurching as if the devil himself was ripping at her womb with his hot poker. She folded down on all fours, yelling. Pearl finished her tea in one swallow, grabbed her sponge and left hastily. Leslie fainted, and Lois grabbed her ankles and dragged him outside. Mona watched her sister-in-law labouring at her feet. She put her hand over her mouth and ran outside retching. So this has turned into a bit of a farce here. Look at what everyone's doing. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Elspeth turns crimson and cried, "Get the doctor." "We haven't got a doctor," said Beulah. A really interesting quote, and again one that shows how restricted this town really is. There's no doctor here. It sort of hints at that idea or the power that Mr. Almanac has. Because of that, he's the only one who has medicine, but also how isolated the town is. "Get someone," she knelt beside Trudy. "Stop making a scene," she said. Trudy bellowed again. Elspeth yelled, "Shut up, you stupid grocer's girl, it's just the baby." I like this quote. Not only is it because we see the conflict and disunity between Elspeth and Trudy that's sort of been waning a little bit, but also because she labels her a stupid grocer's girl when she, in fact, is a grazer's daughter. So she herself married into a prestigious family, just as Trudy has done, but she sees herself as being better. She's quite the hypocrite, is Elspeth Beaumont, particularly in this scene. Now Leslie lay on the lawn, flat on his back, with Lois hosing him down. His toupee had washed off and lay like a discarded scrotum on the grass by his bald head. So he was wearing a rug. Mona stalled the Triumph Gloria 3 times before lurching up onto the nature strip, shattering Marigold's front fence and roaring away with the handbrake burning, the front fender left behind swinging from a denuded fence post. Just then Pearl jogged back around the corner calling, "He's coming, he's coming." And Lois called to Una, "He's coming." And Una called to Elspeth, "He's coming." Trudy yelled and howled. Elspeth shrieked, "Stop screaming." And through clenched teeth between contractions, Trudy growled, "This is all your son's fault, you old witch. Now get away from me or I'll tell everyone what you're really like." And this quote links in nicely to the one that's said by Molly early on in the text. on page number 33 that says that everyone knows everything about everyone, but no one ever tittle-tattles. This is clearly it here, that Trudy threatens Elspeth that she will tell everyone what she's really like. 20 minutes into the labour, Felicity Joy Elspeth Beaumont shot from her mother's slimy hirsute thighs into the bright afternoon and landed just beside Marigold's sterilised towels, with Mr. Almanac standing in distant attendance, so he's quite a long way away. And Beulah Harradine leaned close to Lois and says she's only been married. Last section reads, when Evan got home that evening, he found his nature strip ploughed, his front fence demolished, and all the doors and windows open and an odd smell permeating the house. There was a large stain on the carpet, and in the middle of it, a pile of soiled towels. On top of the towels was a fly-blown lump of afterbirth, like liver in aspic. Marigold, fully clothed, was unconscious in bed, I should say. So, this last part I like, firstly because Evan and Marigold's relationship, which seems perfect on the outside, but really on the inside is abusive. We sort of see that here to an extent. The idea that their house, which was once so really very clean, has now been destroyed and is in a shambles. Similar to the women, while Tilly dresses them and transforms them from an external perspective, internally there's still these evil, conniving, gossiping women full of hatred, particularly for Tilly and Molly. That last quotation is interesting. Marigold, fully clothed, was unconscious in bed. The fact that the phrase fully clothed is used here, and again, this is from Evan's perspective, is really important. The fact that he's noticed that is really interesting, perhaps because normally she's not when she's unconscious in bed. Again, emphasizing his brutal, abusive nature, particularly towards his wife. And we know later on she's going to get or seek and attain justice for his behaviour. So why does the author use humour throughout this text? Why is this a satirical novel? And you can answer this in a number of ways. For me, though, she intersperses these comical scenes because of the tragedy of the text. So many horrendous, horrific things happen to Tilly that this is a way that Ham can break that up for the audience. The other thing is, quite often when she uses humour, it's at the expense of these characters who we loathe. And I think that's really important too, that when humour is used, we are laughing at these people, and in a sense, it provides a sense of justice. So Trudy does get yelled on at by Elspeth. That Trudy is, I guess, looked down upon because she had sex before marriage. So, you know, there's all these little moments in here that, and there's quite often the humorous scenes come up after the really harrowing scenes. So we know that Teddy's death and the funeral, this comes after that. So it's a really important way, I think, for the author to break things up and soften up the audience a little bit. But again, it's something I think you should consider in your analysis because it is in strong contrast to the Crucible. If you were to consider humour in the Crucible, there's a little bit from Giles Corey to a certain extent, and he might be a character that you look at, but it definitely isn't as heightened as it is in The Dressmaker. So when it comes to our key quotations, that first one about William, that he sighed and drained his whiskey, refilled his glass and banged his pipe against a wooden armrest and reached for his tobacco, the unhappiness he finds in his marriage. And I think marriage is an interesting theme that you could look at, and comparing the different marriages across both texts, those that are built on love, acceptance, and those that are based on convenience. The fact that, Tilly is called the witch by the women, interestingly enough, Elspeth is called the witch by Trudy in the very same chapter as well. And that insult that Elspeth calls Trudy a stupid grocer's girl, the idea that Trudy, while she tries to transform herself, she is, to an extent, labelled forever based on her social status and her class. And the last one, and this is when Trudy has a go at Elspeth and says that this is all your son's fault, you old witch. Now get away from me or I'll tell everyone what you're really like. And this is that moment where, while their relationship has always been a little bit tense, it really starts to break down here, and it continually decreases until the end of the text when Trudy gets sent away to a mental asylum. So that's chapter 22, really focus on that idea of satire or black comedy as a way for Ham to showcase the characters and the events in the Dressmaker.